All right. Welcome, everybody. We are at the top of the hour. Maybe we'll give it just a few moments for some more folks to trickle in. And a desperate attempt to fill some of that time, I will offer that I am somewhat under the weather. I'm fighting a cold, among other things. So if I sniffle, sneeze, or cough, I apologize up front. I will do my best to go on mute whenever I feel those things coming on. But I think we're just about after a minute after the hour. So we will jump in right now and bring everybody kind of focused on the topic du jour. It's a topic that I'm really passionate about, third party risk management. I know my colleague and friend here, Rob, who will introduce himself here in a second, is pretty passionate about it. Before we jump in, I just want to touch on some very brief housekeeping items. One, this is designed to be very conversational. We have exactly one official slide. The rest of it is just going to be Rob and I kind of nerding out on these things. So we really want your engagement. So as we're coming up or as we're talking through different topics, different questions, things of that nature, do not hesitate to put any of your questions and or comments into the chat. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question for us per se. If you want to add to the conversation, we are all for that. I mean, when Rob and I talked about this, we agreed that we wanted this to be less of a lecture and more of, two dudes sitting in a bar, drinking a beer, talking about third party risk management. So I really encourage you all to be as engaged as you possibly can. So with that said, here is, basically what we're trying to accomplish in this session. My name is Ryan Patrick. I'm the Vice President of Adoption at HITRUST. My role is mostly multifaceted in that I go to the market and talk to the market every single day about the things that HITRUST is doing. But in my mind, more importantly, I'm learning from the market and bringing that information back internally to HITRUST to continue to shape and evolve the things that HITRUST is doing. I tell people that, I have a real rub in my own mind because I'm HITRUST's biggest critic as well as its biggest advocate all at the same time. So you can't hurt my feelings if you think there are things that you want to ask questions about from a HITRUST perspective with regards to TPRM. Or after this, if you want to ask me questions, just generally, I am happy to entertain and answer any and all those questions. So Rob, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure thing. So my name is Robert Wood. I go by Rob. I am currently the CEO at a company called Sidekick Security. Formerly, though, I was the CISO at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I was there for just shy of 4 years. Before that, I ran security for a couple of different tech companies, but primarily startups. And it was a wild ride going from startup to federal government, career whiplash. But one of the things that got me all fired up about this topic was I've been on both sides of the equation. I've never been on the vendor side of TPRM, I guess, until now. But the but I've been on the filling out of the questionnaires side of things, and I've been on the regrettably the sending side of some kind of questionnaire or request, or having teams under me sending out such things. And I don't like any of it. And so, so that's where Ryan and I started our conversation. And yeah, I'm excited to have this talk because I am a little bullish on this topic, but I think it's all good spirited.
Yeah. So to give everybody a little context, Rob and I connected, I don't know, almost a year ago, I think, just generally just trying to build rapport when he was still at CMS. But then we randomly ran into each other at a conference back in the fall. And we just were, like I said, nerding out on TPRM and all things security. And we were like, man, we should talk about this. We have lots of ideas, we have lots of thoughts, but it'd be great to, kind of publicly present those things and see what we can get back from the audience. So here we are. Congratulations to you all. You are a part of this journey in this conversation. So Rob, I want to start off and kind of set the tone about, you know, challenges that we see generally with third party risk management. And it doesn't have to be, although HITRUST is, born out of healthcare, still somewhat focused on healthcare. It really applies to all industries how TPRM is broken. And I will say that, and I'll probably continue to say that throughout this conversation, that TPRM is broken. It does not work for anyone. Rob, you mentioned, several sides of the coin. It's a problem for everybody involved. Or,
Yep,
can you outline some of the things that you're seeing with your current customers or when you saw at CMS or in previous life?
for sure. So in my current role, so the customers that we have, where like anytime we end up in a conversation about this, and a lot of these are like, similar to the conversation we're having, Ryan, like uh a little bit of a rant on the topic, maybe some mild complaining on people's TPRM frustrations. A lot of it's like if they're on the supplier side and they're filling out these things, it's just annoying because they get told that they have to jump through all these hoops. They got to jump through the SOC 2 hoop, then the ISO hoop, then the PCI hoop. That they got to jump through all these hoops, but then they get some sales, get some big customer in the pipeline. None of those hoops are good enough. They still need them, but they're not good enough, and they have to do all this other stuff. 600 questionnaire. It was due yesterday. Sales guys calling the CEO saying that those annoying security people are holding up the biggest deal in the company's history. Everything's stressful. It's annoying. So that's one side of the frustration is like nothing ever seems to be good enough. And that's like, speaking on that, there is no gold standard and it's overwhelming. But I think that's almost like an operational problem in some way. I mean, some of it's a standards problem, but that's, you end up in like a XKCD comic if you go down that rabbit hole. I think the more interesting side of the coin is the consumer side that are sending out these questionnaires. And one thing that strikes me, and I mean, I get it, like, standards say, we have to be reviewing the risk of our suppliers and da 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 da. There's all of this kind of guidance out there or semi-prescriptive control language that states you're going to do this relative to your suppliers, and that basically sets in motion all of these big functions that are sending out, writing a questionnaire or establishing a questionnaire. Maybe it's got some amount of contextualization and sending those things out, doing kind of inventory management. But what kills me about that whole process is you've got all of this effort that goes into the that goes into basically identifying all these suppliers, sending all these things out. The effort goes into filling them out. Then you have somebody reviewing them. And even if you're reviewing them and like tracking risks, none of those risks are things that the consumer can necessarily do something about. Like it's very unactionable.
Yep.
And that I think is that's the thing that like grinds my gears the most about this is like, take and I'm going to do my best not to call out any particular companies, but take a I just because I not because like there's a lot of companies who, and I think that's one of the other confusing things is you could take a company uh like Govini, Security Scorecard, and Wistic, and they're all like TPRM companies, but they all do very different things. But take a company like that's doing kind of passive monitoring of an ecosystem or of an entity, right? Reporting on patch levels and email configuration, stuff like that. You get those scores back, and it gives you a sense of what things look like in the organization. Like we did a CSF assessment for somebody recently, and like they have all their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers getting continuously monitored under one of these vendors. And so you're getting these scores back, but like what do you do with the results? Like if somebody hasn't, apparently patched their, some web server on their network, like that's not your server to patch. Like, you can send somebody to go talk to them, but ultimately, that's not necessarily your thing to take action on. And your only recourse really is either like nagging, and that only works for so long, or some kind of like contractual means. And a lot of companies, especially with the big cloud service providers, are not even in a position to negotiate contractual terms. Like AWS isn't redlining anything for anyone, unless you're the federal government, perhaps. But the like the mom and pop shop that's trying to do TPRM, like they're not getting custom terms on an MSA or service level agreements or anything. And so everything is just very unactionable. And that, I think, is, there's this weird dichotomy of like we spend so much time, energy, effort trying to find risk on something that we can't necessarily do anything about, not, at least not super tangibly. And that there's this kind of weird disconnect. And so like I think we need to kind of be focused on the other side of the risk equation, is like the stuff that you can control and that gets very little attention. But I mean, to me, those are like that general sense of nothing's ever good enough, and what the heck do I do with all this stuff? Because I can't do anything with this stuff, are probably the two, like, if you were to distill them down, like the two chief frustrations with third party risk management on both sides of those of that equation.
Yeah, you hit on a lot of things that I feel passionate about, and that I hear about day to day and talking to organizations of varying shapes and sizes. One, these unique, bespoke 300, 400 questionnaires are just wearing everybody out on both sides, right? If you're a
Oh yeah.
vendor that has 100 customers and you're answering a 400 question questionnaire, that takes a lot of time and effort, or you're just giving back garbage. Yes,
Yep.
nos, NAs, no other commentary to help distill what is reality within that environment. And if you're the receiver of that questionnaire, the one who initially sent it out, you have to now do some kind of analysis of it. And in my experience, most organizations, and I'm not talking about really large organizations, the AWSs of the world, the Microsofts of the world, but the majority of the folks in that SMB space just don't have the time or the resources to actually do analysis of the answers of those questions, let alone, if they do it, to your point, what do you do with the information that you actually find? You have no recourse for remediation. And what I always tell people is it always boils down to contracts, right? It has to be in some kind of contractual language that is enforceable to get remediation to happen, or the money goes away type of thing. But before we even get there, like, organizations are just completely overwhelmed and completely worn out
Yeah.
by what has become commonplace within the TPRM space at this point. And that to me is, the beginning of the issue. Like, how do we overcome that? How do we alleviate the need for questionnaires? And obviously, as a HITRUST employee and a HITRUST advocate, if you will, like, I'm drawn to the use of HITRUST, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all HITRUST all day or nothing else. There's probably a balance there to a certain extent,
Right.
but we have to do something on the front end of the process before we even ascertain risk. Does that make sense to you, Rob?
Oh, it totally does. Well, and even the challenging dynamic with like a high trust is, and we've got a number of customers who have gone through high trust, and it like works fantastically for them, is the vendor and their kind of customer ecosystem has to also be kind of bought into it. And if they're not, then you end up, it's just like another hoop that you jump through, and it's a harder hoop to jump through than SOC 2, for example. And I think that's what makes it like a kind of a more robust standard, if you will. But the the like higher costs and level of in terms of like level of effort and all the things, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee you that you're going to alleviate that pain of the questionnaire, and that stinks because but if everyone in your like your customer ecosystem is really bought in, they're like this is it. I'm selling to health plans, for example, and all the health plans, they all say it's high trust or bust. And it's like, all right, great, we're going to do this, and that's going to make our lives way easier. But if you don't have that luxury and your customers are still kind of customizing things and all of that, then you're, it doesn't necessarily make your life better. And that's really hard. And then, there's all this buzz about LLMs and, GPTs kind of saving the world. And
Right.
I think there's some really cool promise with that is like, if I could have a GPT that's only trained on my data, it's only going to, answer questions based on my stuff, that also is potentially interesting, but comes with a cost in and of itself.
Yeah, there's
And
there's inherent risk in that as well, for sure.
absolutely, yeah. And so, like everything has a cost. And I kind of come back to the, like if you're doing all of this stuff to assess the risk of the entity, of the supplier entity, if I was to kind of carve up the risk of like third party risk into two buckets, it'd be like the risk that you carry with any given entity. They have stuff that goes wrong in their environment that then impacts you. And then you have the other half of the coin, which is the risk of that entity's resources, whether maybe it's a SaaS tool or it's bodies of that entity's resources operating in your environment. So what I mean by that is like take a software provider like Atlassian. Bless you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Software provider like Atlassian or Okta, and big name companies, a lot of customers. You could review Atlassian or Okta from a software standpoint. They've got the standards, they've got their FedRAMPs, they've got this and that, and they still had some breaches, but but overall, like they have relatively mature security programs. But like that's all entity risk, and then you've got so let's say Mr. or Mrs. Customer goes and buys Jira, Confluence, Okta, and they're deploying it in their environment. And this is where you start getting into like shared responsibility model and such. Like, how does that thing operate in your environment? How do you know that it's operating in a way that you should have confidence in it? And that comes down to like things like how it's configured, who has access to it, what it's connected to. Are you monitoring it? Do you have recovery plans and kind of failover plans and stuff like that? Do you have like, are you doing any kind of like privileged access, privileged account management when it comes to like administrative control over it, all that kind of stuff. And I think that the, so like when cloud first came on the scene, I think the industry did a real disservice to itself when in the way that it talked about the shared responsibility model. And a lot of people walked away thinking and believing that there was a lot more stuff being handled by the cloud service providers than
I'm in
was
the
actually.
cloud. I'm secure.
Well, yeah. And take like the Snowflake stuff that happened recently. You had all these customers who their Snowflake instances got popped because they didn't have MFA enabled. And then stuff like that happens, right? Like you procured a technology, you used it somewhere, you were using it in a certain way, so it had data, it had connections, it had all this stuff, and then it got hit. And so I personally, and I don't know that everyone would agree with me, and that's okay. But I personally lump that kind of thing into the third party risk management umbrella of activities because like take a Acme Bank type customer, they procure Snowflake. I think it's their job to make sure that they understand, like what's the kind of relational threat model, like deployment threat model, look like for how Snowflake exists in Acme Bank's environment? Is Snowflake configured properly? Do all of our admins have unique accounts and MFA turned on? Do all of our standard users have MFA turned on? Are we protecting API keys for any kind of machine identities that are accessing it, or are we monitoring it? Have we configured it and hardened it? Blah blah blah. And because that's not Snowflake's job to do all of that stuff. It's Snowflake's job to do things like secure by design and make sure that Snowflake as an entity doesn't get popped. But
And maybe some default controls turned on that you can have the
exactly,
ability to turn off.
exactly, and that's like you get into like the AWS S3 buckets, not public by default and stuff like that. It's like, um, that was one thing that always cracked me up when I'd be on like AWS calls, or security's job number zero, and it's like that may be the case, but like there's all of these wildly insecure by design things that are kind of rampant across your product suite or your service suite. Like there's some kind of disconnect happening there, guys. But like bringing it back, like I view that bucket of activities as an extension of third party risk management. And so if we spend all our energy and resources on is Snowflake secure in this case, we're monitoring them, sending them questionnaires, they've got their HITRUST, their FedRAMP, they've got all their stuff, but then we don't do anything about how it's deployed in our environment. Then even if you have 100% efficacy on the first part, and you're not doing anything on the second part, you're only halfway there. And that's huge residual risk. And so it's like, can we do a little bit less on on the first part, or like find a happy middle ground on the first part where we're not burning, all of our resources, and then redirect some of those, kind of 80-20 Pareto distribution style to that second part of the risk, and really move the needle on actively managing some amount of risk and making it go down.
Yeah, I think that it's a line that's blurred between TPRM teams and internal security teams, right? And
Totally.
there's got to be that collaboration internally to ensure that a tool that is assessed up front based on just secure design principles and what you would expect to see is actually deployed internally in a secure way. I think that's really interesting. I want to
Yeah.
I want to go back to
Okay. Can I
questionnaires.
actually, before you do that, because I'm going to forget, can I want to make one shout out on
Yep.
somebody who I thought did this amazingly. I have started to advocate for this ever since I heard about it. And I recommend it to other people. And what a great platform to do this, since there's people. But the former CISO over at GSA, this gentleman, Bo Burles, he has since moved on from his post, but he made it a point that anybody who is like any technology provider who is coming into GSA and trying to sell something into GSA, instead of just peppering them with all the questionnaire, and I'm sure they got plenty of questionnaires, like GSA owns FedRAMP, like I'm sure they got questionnaires.
Right.
But one of the things that they asked for that I think was just fantastic and so simple was a secure deployment guide. So any product, if you're going to sell into our environment, you have to tell me how to effectively secure and harden it so it can operate in our environment safely. And then you take that and you pass it on to whoever's going to own it, internal security teams, assessment teams, whatever. And that is such a small tweak in process that I think can have really like just an outsized impact on risk, if it's acted on, of course.
So, because I like analogies, I'm just a dumb army guy. I recently built an outdoor kitchen at my house, and
Nice.
I bought the drop-in grill and everything. And what do I know about hooking up a gas grill? Well, the manufacturer like tells you exactly what you should do and what you shouldn't do to effectively deploy that so your house doesn't blow up. Basically, it's the same principle. I really like that because you hear a lot about like S bombs, but you don't
Mhm.
really hear about secure deployment guides. I think that's an amazing
Well,
concept, actually.
yeah, and like SBOM and SSDF, like those are still like those are a little bit closer to those aren't purely entity risk. They're a little bit closer to deployment risk. It's like how secure is this like unit of this thing that's going to be operating in my environment? But it still doesn't give you control over it. It's just you just know a little bit more about, it's not this risk over here at the entity. It's the thing that they've produced, and now it's going to be over here in my entity. But yeah, it's just very simple, and can't like I have to give full kudos to Bo. This was something I picked up from him, and he's the man. And everyone should, if you're doing this, if you're kind of going through this exercise, especially if you've got a lot of SaaS and kind of past providers, like, you know
So,
try it out.
so the nature of the conversation is we're going to give things to take away or action items, but I think that's appropriate to talk right now. Are you recommending that people write that into a contract, as an option? Say, hey, in order for us to purchase this, we need a secure deployment guide written and delivered, blah, 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 blah. So it's in the contract. They're forced to actually develop it and provide it if they don't have it
Yeah,
as a way
I
to
mean,
move from procurement into deployment.
putting in the contract, I think adds a bit of leverage. I don't know that it necessarily has to be in the contract. I think you could make that put that on the salesperson who's this poor sap's trying to meet their quota and push things over the finish line, and like put them to work for you. Say like this is important to us, like we want to know how to safely deploy this thing, so like please go talk to your engineering team or your product team and get us something, even if it's not an official guide. It's an email.
Yeah, better
that's
than trying to
that's
figure it
better
out
than
with nothing.
absolutely. And it gives somebody something to do that's going to mitigate risk. And so
I
yeah.
like it. I like it. So I'm going to probably harp on this because, again, I'm pretty passionate about it. Like, I personally believe, I just want to put all the cards on the table. Questionnaires, security questionnaires need to go away. I do think questions about the relationship, the types of data being consumed, some things like that will never
Super
go
important.
away, nor should they ever go away.
Correct. That's
But
like
a question,
context. That's deployment context.
yeah, but questionnaires that are trying to understand whether MFA is deployed, do you have EDR, all the security types of things that you would ask, I personally think that needs to go away because of all the things we said thus far. But
Yep.
I want to scratch on that for a second. I've been the person who has helped develop these types of questionnaires, and admittedly, like I kind of did some loose research, and I developed the questions based on what I could gather from other sources plus my own personal experience and knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think that's generally the case. But what I think is missing, and something that I'm, again, personally pretty passionate about, is we need to stop developing these things in a vacuum and use data sources that actually matter. And what I've been telling folks recently is you need to be looking at threat data. Like, what matters today based on the threat landscape? Those are the things that you should be focused on, not because NIST or CMMC or ISO or whomever tells you these are the controls that you must demonstrate maturity against, but focus on the controls that are actually going to protect against the threats that are happening today. And even if you use threat intelligence to develop the questionnaire at first, within 6 to 12 months, it's probably outdated to a certain degree. And I think that's an aspect that people aren't paying enough attention to. I've talked to organizations like, oh, well, we got this questionnaire 4 years ago. Well, shoot. Think about what's changed in 4 years. I mean, we weren't even really talking about AI, even though it existed. Now with the advent of Gen AI, like it's become more of a forefront type of question.
Yep.
But what other technologies should we be focused on that we're not because our questionnaire is outdated and it's relatively quote unquote static? Does that make sense? Like, do
It
you think
does. Yeah.
that's a big issue in your world?
I think it is. And I think part of the, so, well, first I should say, I totally agree on the threat front. So like when I was at CMS, I had the opportunity to work on this thing, the CPGs, the cybersecurity performance goals, and the the team that I worked with the health sector coordinating council, and Eric Decker was my like private sector lead. If you happen to know him, either personally or professionally, he's the man. I should just say that. But he and the HSCC contributed to this thing called Hiccup, HICP. I think is how it enunciates down to, or acronymizes down to, and it was very heavily tilted towards threat data, as were the CPGs. Like we started off with this big like kind of landscape analysis. We got data from Sensinet. We got data from all of these different places. DBIR, all that, and then we went ahead and kind of extrapolated controls that were aligned to the things that we observed in the threat data for the healthcare sector, obviously. And I think there's a lot of like a lot of merit to that. And I think one of the challenges though is like in that 4 years ago analogy you provided, there's even though things have changed wildly in 4 years, some of the stuff that's still like just basic good practices, like want to make sure you're not maybe you have a handle on background checks and onboarding, offboarding, or BYOD and stuff like that. Like even though those aren't like front and center to concerns in today's like security conversation, there's still like good practices, and uh, so I think there's this desire to want to make sure that like those good practices are still kind of like you have this like kind of core of good practices that kind of moves around, and then there's like this kind of squishy layer on top that's the threat stuff that's kind of like pulling things forward, and and the core kind of gets wider and wider as things grow and technology is introduced and all of that. But the squishy threat part is always that's always moving, that's always changing. And yeah, there's like the desire to look at the whole thing, but of course that that creates a lot of this silly questionnaire tension that exists.
Yeah, and I think that point is absolutely valid, and I'm not suggesting that we ignore all of the other stuff, right?
Of course, yeah. No, I didn't
Yeah.
take it that way. It's just
When you talk about identifying risk and risk remediation, and oh by the way, I can't get my vendors to actually answer the 300 or 400 questionnaire. Understanding which one of those controls actually are protecting against your threats or the threats today helps focus you, right? Okay, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor, you know, you've taken 6 months to answer this questionnaire. Can you at least answer these 30? Like I need to know the answer to those right now. Or conversely, they've answered the 300 or 400 questionnaire. Please, let's get rid of them altogether. Is, you know, when you're doing your analysis, you're not going through a compliance exercise at that point for a BYOD policy versus the controls that you actually have on those BYOD endpoints, because that's what matters and that's what you can focus on. You can go back to that vendor and say, okay, we've identified these 15 things that you have gaps on, but I really need you to focus on these two right here because these two really, really matter. And I think that's a huge gap, so to speak, within
I
current
agree.
practices today because it's a shotgun blast. Hey, give me everything, and then it's a shotgun blast. Go fix everything. And based on the limited resources on both sides of the coin, whether you're the vendor or the buying party, you just don't have enough time to try to do all of it. So you have to be I don't want to say selective, but you need to be focused. Do you know what I mean?
Agreed. Yeah, and yeah, I think that's well said. the focus, I mean, it's kind of like, I've used the term already. It's kind of, I mean, it's the Pareto distribution applied to, the questions. It's like, what are the 20% of the questions here or less, whatever, that have an impact on, have an outsized impact on risk. And maybe it's AI practices and, I don't know, account management or something, you know, and then you just focus put most of your eggs in that basket. And it's like, I want to know what you're doing with our data. And I want to know who's, that I want to have confidence that who's operating over in that environment is who you think they are and who I think they are. Or maybe it's something else based on the threat data. But yeah, I like the focused approach. Like if you're gonna be doing that kind of entities level risk, and I don't think you should neglect that. And then I think focusing it is really important.
Yeah, I mean, and I've actually tried to find, which I have not successfully found, a really great source, but I've tried to find the average amount of time that a TPRM analyst spends on either a single control or analyzing a complete questionnaire. But let's say it's an hour. You know, can you
There's
really?
no way it's an hour. Or
Well,
you mean for a single control or a single question?
potentially a single question. I would be shocked if it's actually an hour for per question because that would be 300, and I'm making up the numbers, 300 per questionnaire. There's no way that an
Yeah,
analyst is spending that amount of time. It's actually probably a
it's
fraction of that per control. But if you
yeah. I
think
mean,
about,
you're talking a couple of days, maybe a week and a half or so per
right,
questionnaire, or something like that.
right. So what kind of due diligence and what kind of assurance is being provided if you're spending 15 minutes, and I'm making up the numbers, per control within that questionnaire, which I still think would be somewhat aggressive. Um, it's not doing it justice. You're not able to spend that amount of time, so you have to rely on um, either automation
Yep.
or things like HITRUST, again, showing my bias, who are doing a lot of this work and have hired assessors who have spent hundreds of hours dissecting these controls and validating that they're in place. Like I just don't see how spending, again, like 10 or 15 minutes per control in these questionnaires really is helping anybody at this point.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I've often thought too that on some level, and I know you can't necessarily rely on this for the on a universal level because then the dynamic kind of goes away. But on some level, I feel like the market kind of takes care of that baseline set of security posture reviews for most organizations. For example, the for a small, let's say like a tech startup or SMB type customer, the they're going to be out using tools or vendors who have probably gotten screened and reviewed by a zillion other providers already. And it's like you're not gonna ask the magic question that nobody else has thought of, more than likely. And so because of that, it's like, why, and I get it, is it, you have to do it, or like you're driving there because of compliance, but like you're kind of wasting your time as a result. Like, you're not gonna learn something new, and therefore you're not gonna do anything new or different. And it's like, so if you have these established players, it's like, does the market kind of correct some of this stuff over time, with people getting their SOC 2s and their high trusts and their ISOs and all of that stuff, and breaches happening, and then that causing a certain amount of change, on the heels of that. There's there's something interesting about that dynamic that has always it's kind of floated around in the back of my head, but I don't think that's actually a strategy that orgs can necessarily. They'd have to be very intentional about, like, this is a thing we're not going to spend time on because we would rather put our security eggs in a different basket, making sure EDR is in place and, MFA is in place and all that stuff, than do this ourselves. And so we're just gonna trust that things are happening because we're not the first customer of these organizations.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I always joke with people that whenever a new standard regulation or framework comes out, nobody's making up new controls, right? Like we're basically recycling the same types of controls. We just may phrase them or name them differently. Like the core controls for HITRUST and the core controls for SOC and ISO and NIST and so on and so forth. There's so much overlap that
Tons of
it's
overlap.
not the controls that matter, which actually probably sounds contradictory to my last soapbox comment around being threat focused. It what's equally important is, or in this case more important, is the assurance or the process built on ascertaining the maturity and the scalability and the functionality of those controls within the environment, right? Because questionnaires are self-attestations. Whether you base that questionnaire off of whatever you think is important or you base it off of 853, 171, HITRUST, ISO, whatever it may be, it doesn't matter if you're just accepting yes, no, and doing nothing about it. Like you have to dig deeper in the validation and the level of rigor to identify that maturity or the functionality of the control, or the effectiveness is probably a better way of putting it, of that control, is really the difference. And until we recognize that, I'm not sure there's much is going to change in the TPRM space. We're still going to see breaches. We're still going to see incidents because we've accepted a yes no answer that may have been filled out by a salesperson who may or not know what EDR stands for. So that's another one of my soapbox items is, assurance matters. The level of rigor, the comprehensiveness of the way that the control is tested or proved, it is really, really important to protecting yourself and reducing risk.
Yep. So I got one for you. I minimized my full screen here and took a glimpse at the chat, and there's some chatter about Vimeo being high risk on one of the attendees organizations, or a list there. One of the things that I've also found a lot of inconsistency, not just in the controls, but is how does one classify a supplier or a prospective supplier into like a risk bucket? Like, how do you know? And this was a conversation that we had at CMS a lot, uh, and I would get into heated arguments with people. Is we would have people flagging the number of findings associated with something like a system or an application or what have you, a vendor, and using that to determine its risk level. And for example, uh, somebody goes and buys or wants to buy or has built something. It's just riddled with vulnerabilities. It went through a pen test. It's just atrocious. But you're not going to use it for anything important. It's going to be completely not mission critical. It's not connected to things. It's not, it's kind of like it's like in the banking world, for example, you have, they'll spin up like marketing websites, or, video studios, Warner Brothers, they'll spin up like marketing websites for a new movie or a new credit card product, something like that. And in theory, those things are like, they could be built absolutely horribly, be littered with vulnerabilities, but they may not be high risk in the sense that they're not connected to your critical assets. But maybe they are in the back end, and that's a more interesting like red team style discussion or architecture discussion. But I think it invites an important question, that is, how do you determine, or like how do you bucket things into, like, how do you determine the risk level of a particular supplier? Like how would you frame that? I know how I would frame it, but how would you frame it, out of curiosity?
Yeah, that actually speaks to the number two that's on the screen right now, the blind spots are clearing. And really what that's talking about is typically organizations they'll do some kind of inherent risk question series, if you will, and they'll bucket their vendors there. But then they'll only focus on their tier one or highest, most critical vendors, and they kind of ignore the mid tier and the low risk vendors. But
How would you determine, or how would you define like tier one or critical suppliers though?
well, like any good security professional, I will answer with it depends. But generally speaking, you have to understand your own risk appetite, right? As an organization, are you really, really conservative, or are you willing to take a little more risk to drive innovation or drive growth or what have you? You marry that with typical attack vectors, right? Whether it be remote privileged access, or you have all of my data, or maybe this is a product and or service that is critical to me being able to operate as a business. Like there's a lot of different things that an organization should consider that's important to them to drive what the risk tolerance is, where different vendors would fall within that in those specific risk profiles. So I can't say it's like these five things that make everybody critical. But
Sure.
what I would say is it's a combination of security practices bounced off of what's happening today from a threat perspective. MFA is the biggest thing that everybody's talking about, right? Because if you look at the biggest incidents last year, many of them revolved around a lack of MFA. So maybe if there's no MFA, that vendor shoots up. But I think it's important to point out that you mentioned, hey, there's a pen test that's riddled with vulnerabilities and stuff like that. To me, that is what you've figured out post categorizing these vendors, right? Because you're not getting that up front. That is being developed. Okay, I've bucketed this vendor as, let's say, low. I have this vendor that is a low risk to me based on these seven things that I care about: amount of data, remote access, critical product or service, whatever the seven may be. You then do some kind of due diligence on them, and you identify, well, their pen test is just an absolute mess. Well, that becomes a risk mitigation and risk management issue even after the fact in trying to ascertain the inherent risk just based on the relationship in general. So I don't know if I'm answering your question like as succinctly and concise as the audience probably wants me to, but what I'm trying to get people to think about is it's not purely a security play. It's not purely a security decision. It's a business decision in how to risk rank or risk tier your vendors to ultimately put them through some kind of process that matches that risk profile. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And where my head goes when I think about that is a similar line is, what the what is the vendor, or what does that vendor mean to you, or what it is they're supplying mean to you? And part of that, I think, is the data that they have. Part of that's the maybe the operational function that they're supporting, and how mission critical that is. It's like, are they tied into a profit center or something like that can't go down, or you really don't want to go down, things of that nature. So it's like, for the security folks, spending time up front to, like, before you go out and like build a program, spending time to really think through the things that matter to you and how you would measure those things, like basically what would happen to make you notice, and then kind of classifying your vendors based along those dimensions, and then let that produce your risk scoring, because like some may be much more security sensitive versus some may be very like operationally sensitive, and or like brand sensitive, for example, but like have no operational impact. And so there's like different ways to categorize vendors. And I think that's also really interesting. Like, we talked about the threat contextualization and stuff earlier. If you had, let's say, a like a marketing or branding or PR firm or something that was, a vendor of yours, and they were really important, or your website provider, your www website, but that wasn't holding any customer data, like from a branding standpoint. And a lot of organizations will outsource that stuff to like a marketing agency. And you'd want to make sure that that marketing agency is doing certain stuff to make sure that your brand doesn't take a nosedive or look silly. But you're gonna treat them differently, ideally, than you would somebody who's storing a bunch of PII, credit card data, etc. And that, I think, is a really, like, it's a very foundational question of like how you risk classify and think through that. But I think it, like, when you go through that exercise, it will invite so much valuable kind of discussion and process and stuff that'll happen in an organization around how they're like really doing, like how they want to do third party risk, not how like some you know talking head says they should do third party risk, but like how they really want to do it and how it matters to them. Because that I think that's really interesting to me. And so it's like, it's such a simple question, but it's, I think, a really important one when you like peel everything back.
Yeah, and we had somebody comment right along those lines of our collective comments that, and I'm paraphrasing, it's really a business decision on how to tier, and there's a lot of input from different stakeholders. And one that they mentioned was the legal team, right? As security people, we have legal implications always in the back of our minds, but understanding how to deal with state government or federal government contracts from a legal perspective and how that could be impacted based on incident X, Y, or Z is an important aspect to tiering vendors. And then I really liked your comment around spinning up these websites that may be riddled with stuff. My mind goes to social media platforms for businesses where the accounts get hacked, and then the account starts to post things that are less than desirable. That's a
Yeah,
reputational issue. But are you
absolutely.
putting, yeah, are you putting X in LinkedIn through the ringer? In most cases, in my experience,
No,
organizations aren't
or
looking at
that like
tier.
rinky-dink marketing agency that's like just
Right.
just got snazzy slide decks, and it's a couple of folks just who are great at social media marketing and stuff. Like, no, you're not
Yeah.
putting it through the ringer.
It speaks to not only focusing on your critical or high risk vendors. You do need to figure out a balance and a process to at least get some visibility into those tier three, and if you have tier four type of vendors, to understand that there is inherent risk there, and you just have
Yep.
to figure out what your acceptance or your risk tolerance for those lower tier are, and then build a process to address that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and like the fourth party thing, um, the fourth party thing is interesting because, like, on some level, that then starts to, like, you start drifting into an you start to drift into like a kind of an inventory discovery kind of function. Like there's tools out there that will support SaaS discovery on a network to like identify shadow IT. But then it's like, all right, so those are third parties. Then how do I find my fourth parties? And then, that like a lot of these bigger supply chain tools have mapping, like they've got data from all this work that they've done where like they know within a reasonable degree of accuracy, like all the suppliers that Atlassian, because we used them earlier, are using. It's like, all right, so then you can kind of like look out. But, even then, I think that like ruthless contextualization is really important because like if you're trying to fix or even like reason about everything, that just gets like really, really hard. But if you're like, just to play this out, let's say you're running like the stock exchange or something that's like highly availability centric, and you really want to make sure that you're not going to have any any risk, or at least minimal risk as possible, um, flowing, kind of resulting from your supply chain. So like you may go through all of this, kind of discovery, you figure out who your critical suppliers are supporting that particular function, who their suppliers are, who are supporting that function, all of that. And then, building on that, you've got like you may not necessarily be able to do anything about the fourth party, but maybe you can run tabletop exercises or something to know how you would respond should something happen. Like bring it back to like something you can do. And that I think is just it like I'm a big advocate of just finding the things that you can actually do. But yeah, anyways, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, stay on your soapbox. I do it often. I need the company.
All right, so nice up there.
That's right. So we're running short on time. We had a few questions come in. So first one is, where should a security architect start with building a security program and the effectiveness of controls? How much rigor should teams keep evidence improve what they're doing in their org? So if I'm reading this correctly, I'm thinking this is on the customer side, not the vendor.
That's the way I interpret that. Yeah.
Okay. Any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what comes to mind for me is like, think through like think through your classification process, like how you would want to, like what things matter to you enough where you would want to know how each vendor is being used, operational kind of deployment, integrations, user base, supported data, whatever. And, build out identify a couple of controls that map to each of those things. And then, like you kind of run your inventory through that process, but like keep it minimalist so that way it's manageable.
Yeah, I would probably repeat what I said earlier. Focus on the things that matter. Try to use threat data as much as possible, and then putting my biased high trust hat on for a second. Utilize third party assessments, third party certifications as much as possible, because arguably an external assessor for high trust who's going to spend 500 or 600 hours ascertaining the level of maturity is way more than you'd ever be able to spend on your own on that vendor. There's other options out there, but obviously I feel most passionate about high trust. So, all right, next question. When a vendor is issued an ISO ISMS certificate and say that's all they have during due diligence, can that alone be sufficient for a vendor security posture with an assumption the controls are in place and no issues identified? What else can be obtained from the vendor in such a scenario? So I'm gonna jump in real quick and then gather your thoughts. And I know we're at the top of the hour. There's questions we didn't get to. We will respond to those via email. But generally speaking, an ISO cert has been validated by an unbiased third party. So I would say, generally there is a level of assurance that's built into that. That doesn't mean that you can't sample some of the results. Meaning, if you really care about MFA, take the ISO cert, take the HITRUST cert, but then ask for evidence that MFA is in place. Spot check those things. I don't think you need to run them completely through the ringer again, though.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, figure out like what your context is and what really matters, and then like pull a couple of things out, because like ISO covers a bunch of stuff. A lot of it, I think, is annoying and pedantic, but uh, but but it also covers some good stuff too. And it's like you don't want to like just redo all that.
For sure. All right, we're over on time. Rob, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. As I mentioned to everybody, we will send out the answers to your questions as you ask them, since we didn't get to all of them. Here is us and a QR code for our LinkedIn accounts. If you want to connect with us, follow us, engage with us on LinkedIn. This is a conversation that we're constantly having, and we'd love your thoughts. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.
Yeah. Ryan, I got to say, this talk about some Instagram versus reality stuff happening here with our pictures.
No, we both look great, especially me under the weather.
Oh man. Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks for having me.
For sure. I'll talk to you, Rob. Thanks so much.
All right. See ya.